disgraceful. That's how former President Trump characterized day one of the $250 million civil fraud trial against him, per the AP. Visibly perturbed and indignant, the ex-president started off the week in a New York courtroom where he voluntarily attended the trial that State Attorney General Letitia James brought against him.
Trump delivered brief remarks before entering the courtroom. Let's watch.
If I weren't leading in all the polls, or if I weren't running, I wouldn't have any of these cases. I wouldn't be seeing you this morning. But I'll be seeing a lot of you, because this is a horrible thing that's happening to our country, and we've got to get it straightened away. So we'll go in and see our rogue judge, and we'll listen to this man. And I think most people get it. People are getting it. I can tell you the voters getting it, because every time they give me a fake indictment, I go up in the polls, and that's never happened before. But this is a disgrace.
Here to break down the case as day two is getting underway is Mailman, a former legal advisor to President Donald Trump. Thanks for joining us, May.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So what do you make of Trump's statements that all of this wouldn't be happening if I wasn't running and I wasn't number one in all of the polls?
Well, it's certainly a factor, but we have to remember that the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, campaigned on suing Trump every day. And he was president at the time, and she didn't campaign on suing the office of the presidency, which is something very common for attorney generals to say, you know, I'm concerned about federal power. I'm going to take that power back, you know, make sure that states can regulate within their borders. No, she said that she was going to wake up in the morning, sue Trump, and then come back. So she has to follow through on that promise. And she called him an illegitimate president at the time. So part of this was inevitable. I think maybe regardless of whether he was going to run, she had made that campaign promise. But I think that the urgency was there to get this done sooner rather than later, and to find something that would fit, because he is running for president, and her constituency doesn't like that.
Yeah, well, it seems a little silly even to try to debate the point of whether or not Letitia James holds kind of personal and political animus for Donald Trump or his political agenda. But Donald Trump still has to contend with some of the factual basis for these claims, namely some of these claims that he's made about the value of his real estate holdings, specifically Mar-a-Lago and his Trump Tower apartment. The Mar-a-Lago valuation in particular has been a point of consternation, with people going back and forth about the idea that the number that the court is using is dramatically undervalued. But the judge made the point of saying yesterday that he was not the one, reiterating that he was not the one that came up with this valuation number, but that instead it was a determination made by the Palm Beach assessor. And even taking the upper end of the Palm Beach assessor's number and tripling it or quadrupling it, you're still well under the number that Donald Trump valued Mar-a-Lago as being. So is this really a factual issue that Trump has to contend with, even the bias of the prosecutor aside?
So unfortunately for Trump, he's already lost the factual issue. So this judge already decided that everything that he said was fraudulent. So the only thing really that they're fighting about in court are other matters like statute of limitations, you know, how many claims can the AG bring, and then mental state. So did he intend to be fraudulent, and in which documents did he so intend? But the factual point, I think, is the thing that will be a huge issue on appeal, because yes, you do have the Palm Beach County assessor's numbers, but as we all know, the assessment for our houses for tax value is very different than the assessment that people make when they're putting an offer in a house. So just because an expert or a layperson or whoever makes a determination of value does not mean that that value is the value and you can, you know, never deviate from it. I think it's pretty obvious that Trump had a very high opinion of his real estate, potentially higher than is normal or higher than is warranted. But the real issue in this case for me is not whether he inflated the value of his properties. The question is, so what? He's dealing with very, very sophisticated banks. Those banks are not just saying, oh, well, Trump said he's worth $10 billion. That's great. These banks, their whole business model is based on taking representations, taking facts that they know, and then making a deal. And in this case, the deal that the banks made was preferable to the banks. They were always paid, and they were always paid on time. Collectively, the banks here made hundreds of millions of dollars in interest.
But isn't the issue here not whether... I'm sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
Is it your legal opinion that that defense that the banks were responsible for ensuring that these valuations were accurate is going to work in court for Donald Trump?
So it already didn't. Like I said, he already lost on the fraud issue, and their defense was two-pronged, which is, one, the New York Attorney General doesn't even have authority in this case because she's supposed to represent the state's interest. And the state doesn't really have an interest when you have two parties who made a deal and both parties were benefited. So that's one thing. She doesn't even have standing. She can't even be here because the state hasn't been defrauded. Judge ruled against them. I don't know how that's going to go on appeal. Then, so I think then there's another portion that has to do with what they call the worthless clause, which is I am making these representations, and I just want to let you know these representations could fluctuate. It doesn't exactly say this representation is worthless, throw it out. It basically says, take this for what it's worth. It could go up, it could go down. And because you're making that disclaimer, Trump's team says, the whole thing is worthless. And the judge also rejected that. You know, I think maybe on its own, that also could go either way. But combined, I think you do have a powerful case that these are representations between two sophisticated parties, and it feels a little bit awkward to have a third random party in a two-party deal that went well. So maybe each one on its own is a maybe. Hope, combined, I guess the hope is that they've got a strong case on appeal.
I mean, it's an interesting case, and we've been talking a lot about the Epstein, J.P. Morgan Chase settlement and case out of the Virgin Islands. And there again is another instance where J.P. Morgan Chase seemed to have no issue, no financial issue, no losses from interacting with Jeffrey Epstein. But the question was whether or not it was inappropriate for them to have banked with him in a way that facilitated his illegal activities elsewhere. So I do think that it's not necessarily just whether or not the bank suffered a loss that can determine whether or not fraud or some other illegal activity took place. And it also is worth noting, of course, that the New York court's precedent suggests that a 10 to 20% fluctuation in valuation of it is, of course, typical and normal. And the question here is whether or not Donald Trump intentionally acted fraudulently when he tripled the estimated square footage of his New York property, and when he estimated that his Mar-a-Lago property was worth 3,000, not three times, not 300% more, but 3,000% more than the local valuation. But I want to turn to an interview that Donald Trump, that we watched over the weekend, in which Attorney General Merrick Garland insisted that the legal cases against both Donald Trump and Hunter Biden are independent and unbiased. Facing multiple charges, civil and criminal, Trump made some arguably bizarre remarks at a rally in Iowa Sunday, saying he would choose dying by electrocution rather than being eaten by a shark. Here's a Trump in his own words.
But if I'm sitting down and that boat's going down and I'm on top of a battery and the water starts flooding in, I'm getting concerned. But then I look 10 yards to my left and there's a shark over there. So I have a choice of electrocution or shark. You know what I'm going to take? Electrocution. I will take electrocution every single time. Do we agree? I will take electrocution.
Now, the frontrunner's remarks were part of his critique of sustainable energy technology, pledging to repeal President Biden's electric vehicle mandate. I want to give you a chance to weigh in here.
Yeah, well, this is classic Trump, and I think this is what people like about him. They don't see him as a politician. They see him as a guy. He's the kind of person you could have a kind of funny conversation with at the bar. And when you look at the slate of other primary candidates, Some of them are extremely competent, have done, have worked at the highest levels of federal government or at the highest levels in their states, have really good results to show. And yet the primary voters, there's just something that's missing. There's something they don't like. And that thing is those people are politicians. And, it's maybe a little bit funny. Of course, Trump is a politician. He was president. He's the ultimate insider. He knows all of the players in DC. He negotiated or didn't negotiate deals with Congress. These are people who are on a speed dial. But when he's having funny conversations about getting electrocuted by your, EV battery, I think that is exactly what the primary voters like about him. And yeah, I think the broader picture of we have a government, including the government of California, because they can make their own energy policy too, illegally, in my opinion, shoving down to the throats of the American people an EV agenda, and people don't like it. They feel underwater by it.
So I think Donald Trump is one of these candidates that is unfortunately very funny. Sometimes he says things very seriously. Sometimes we get long monologues like the one we just saw. Something he did after the trial, we know that they're likely to appeal from several different angles. Donald Trump questioned the constitutionality of the application of the law in the fraud case. What do you make of that defense? Is that something that Donald Trump just posted to Truth Social for his followers, or do you see their legal team actually taking the approach of questioning the ruling from a constitutional perspective?
So I haven't seen a constitutional argument thus far. Their attorneys in the motion to dismiss stage and at the summary judgment stage both had, like I said, a standing argument. You haven't been harmed, state of New York. You don't really have a voice. You don't have a say. You don't have standing here. And then also this worthless clause, which is not to say that the Constitution won't somehow come in. And especially if Trump becomes president, then I think that you're going to see both the Georgia case and the New York case there being very strong constitutional arguments that these cases cannot continue against a sitting president because states can't interfere with the workings of the federal government. They can't hamper the workings of the president. So I don't know whether that's going to be a future argument, or maybe they're trying to say, hey, because I am a front runner, you actually are interfering with the workings of the federal government. But anyway, it's not something that's been written down yet. It's not something that was really argued or opening arguments yesterday, but it's not to say that there is not something on the horizon.
Mailman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.